Figma's new glass effect finally gives designers a way to recreate a glassmorphism look without a ton of workarounds. We used to have to stack a bunch of different blurs and have a ton of different layers to kind of fake the depth, and now we finally have a dedicated way to do this, and it only takes a couple minutes. In this video, I'm going to show you how the effect works, as well as how to recreate a modern sidebar that looks like something from Apple's liquid glass. So this is what we're going to be recreating. This is just a simple collapsible sidebar that has kind of that frosted look. I'll talk about how to apply this to the container. We'll look at some of the edges and other effects and styles you can add. And we'll touch briefly on things like legibility and how to solve for when the contrast just isn't enough. Obviously, this is something that Apple has been kind of struggling with lately. If you've been paying attention to any of the betas that have been going out for iOS 26 and other platforms. So even things you're going to see within Figma may have even changed with new updates. But the point is, we now have the tools to get really close and we don't have to spend a ton of time doing it. If you didn't already know, Apple actually does have a full iOS and iPadOS 26 UI kit built right into Figma. So if you go up to the Assets tab and you scroll down to UI kits, you're going to see Material, the Simple Design System, and then Apple System here. They have hundreds of components here, so you can definitely play around with it. But some of the specific things you're going to want to look for are things like the windows, the toolbars, and any kind of containers. So if we pull up something like the materials, you'll actually see this is the container for that liquid glass look. What we're creating is going to get very close to this, but if you don't feel like creating anything from scratch, this is also built right in and might save you some time. So the first thing to note is that the glass effect can only be applied to frames. So what we want to do is just grab a photo. Whenever you're working with glassmorphism, you're definitely going to want some sort of visual behind just to even see what you're doing and to know that it's working. I've even started adding a fill to some of my components just to see what I'm doing. When it starts getting too layered, especially with Figma's UI, it can kind of get tough to see what you're doing. So let's just create a new frame. I'll just drag this out like this. The first thing we'll do is add a fill. I'm going to use 100% white and I'm going to dial it back to about 30%. Now you can add a stroke if you want to kind of make the edges of your container stand out just a little bit more. If you do, I would recommend also keeping that subtle, something like 1 pixel wide and 20-30% opacity. Then finally, we're going to jump into the effects, and where you usually would select drop shadow, layer blur, background, you're going to see that new effect called glass. Now this is in beta, and to be honest, I haven't noticed too many issues with it, at least aesthetically. The main thing I'll call out is that it can get a little laggy if you're using a ton of these shells, and especially if you're kind of overlaying them quite a bit, your Figma file will definitely start to slow down. So the first setting we can adjust is the light settings. So we can actually adjust the intensity and then the angle as well. But you can also just click and drag this little box to fix the angle. And typically you want to kind of match that to whatever the light source of your visuals is. Then we have refraction, and this is really just controlling how much the glass impacts with or interacts with the background layer. So if you look at this kind of line right here, if I drag this all the way down, you can have it be pretty much continuous, and it starts to look more just like a regular background blur. Now we also get control over the depth of that refraction. So if I zoom back into that border, you can see this straight line is kind of bending out here as the light hits it to kind of emulate that curve around our container. So if I drag this up, you'll see we get a lot more, and we're actually starting to even interact with the basic textures here, not even just straight lines. For what we're doing, we're probably just going to leave this around 15 or 20. Honestly, the dispersion is not something I can really see a difference in. It might be doing something in the border, but it's not really something I've messed around with and don't really feel a need to tweak. And then last, but certainly not least, we also can control the amount of frost. Now, actually going back to that example from Apple, they do actually have quite a bit of frost, at least in this current iteration of the Figma UI kit. Personally, I feel like you can go a little too far with the frosting, and I think we're going to probably leave this at a pretty low setting. Again, these are just all settings you're going to have to tweak depending on what you're putting inside and how much legibility and contrast you need. We'll leave this at something like 10 just to keep it pretty subtle. And then typically Apple's corners are pretty rounded, so we might do something like 32 or even 48 just to get a very kind of rounded, bubbly look. Now, as far as layering goes, I could duplicate this out just to show you. You can see that it's definitely getting lighter, but just know that the actual glass effect, where it's blurring, adding the frost, anything to do with those settings, is only going to be applied to the layer closest to your background. So in this case, everything we designed and tweaked on that first layer is going to be interacting with the photo. You can't really have like a multiplying effect, at least not in its current state. It's obviously getting lighter just because we have a lot of transparent fills, like 30-40% white, but that's just normal rectangles overlaying on top of each other. There's not like a compounding of the glass effect happening there. So that's everything you need to know about the glass effect. Next, we're going to jump into creating that sidebar. So here's all the components we're going to be building. Now, this might be overkill to some people, but I feel like it gives you a lot more control, especially if you need to scale this up and add more features down the road. We have a logo, we have our sidebar item, we have this little collapse icon, and then the sidebar itself with a expanded and a collapsed state. Obviously, if you already have some of these elements, like you have different icons and you have different buttons, you can certainly sub those in and you can mix with everything I'm about to show you. But just to show you the end-to-end process, we're going to start by putting in these different pieces. We'll assemble the components, and then we'll prototype that expanded and collapsed view in prototype mode. So I am going to cheat, and I'm just going to grab the icon and the label here so I don't have to start from scratch. Now, I'm going to change this to black just so we can see what we're doing. And I am actually using the SF Pro symbols for my icons. I do that a lot, just I feel like it's easier to work with, and I don't really have another icon pack I use on my personal machine. But this is set to 20 pixels, and then I'm using the same SF Pro font for the label. So let's go ahead and select all of that and hit Alt-Command-K. We can call this sidebar item. And then let's go up to properties and add a variant. I also like to hit Shift A when I'm here, just so that as I duplicate things out, the whole component's going to wrap all the variants that I'm creating. And for this one, we're going to call this hover. We'll create one more and call it active. I don't think we rename, and the first one's called default, that's fine. So for the hover effect, we're going to add a simple fill. I'm going to have 100% black and probably just something like 12% opacity. And then for the active, we're going to add a fill. This is up to you if you want it to be more subtle. I'm going to go with more of like a blue that you might see on Mac OS. And then I'm going to add some padding and corners. So I'm just going to select all the variants, and we're going to change the corners to, I think 4 pixels is good. Let's make sure that auto layout has been applied. So we'll hit Shift A on default, hover, and active. I could have done that first before duplicating, and then I'm going to add 8 pixels on the left and right, and we'll add 4 pixels on top and bottom. Make sure that the width is set to hug, so it's actually wrapping to fill our label. And then something up with our component, let's just set that to hug as well. So these are our simple states. It doesn't look like much, but let's hit Shift E and we'll jump into prototype mode. Let's drag an arrow to from the default to the hover and just change this trigger to while hovering. And then as far as the active state, that's going to be set inside the component with whatever page we're working on. So we're good to go. You could go a step further here and you could link the text and the icon to additional properties if you wanted to be able to override that. To do that, you go over to the top right where it says item name, you can click this little property and then select add, and this would be label. And now if we drag that out, you'll be able to override whatever goes inside that label. One property we do want to add is a toggle to hide the label. We're going to override this when we switch to our collapsed sidebar so that all the labels are hidden and it just shows icons. So you can just select the item name here, come up to the top right where it has the multi-edit variants, hit Command R and just change this to label. So what we did is actually highlighted all of the text layers across the components and changed it to label. That way they're all named the same and it's not going to mess up when we're in prototype mode. And then over by appearance, next to the eye, select this property, add a new one here and just say hide label and set that to false. Hit create property and you'll see that all those are all automatically hidden. Now we probably want to show these by default, so you can come back to hide label and say true. I think I actually have that backwards, so it should be show label, not hide label, but you get the idea. Now let's go ahead and drag the default item into our frame that we created inside of our demo example here. And let's change this frame to apply auto layout. Just hit Shift A and that'll wrap. I'm gonna have probably like just 32 pixels all around for the padding. This corner radius is a little intense, so maybe like 25 or something like that. So let's select our sidebar item and we can duplicate this out. I'm gonna hit Shift A just to wrap that in an auto layout. You can hit Enter and then just duplicate as many as you need. Grab a logo from our logo ipsum. I think we'll go with this one from last time. And we'll just drag that into the top of our sidebar. So we're getting the sidebar created, and again, we haven't turned this into a component yet, just because I want to see how it's actually affected inside of the actual screen, so we can see that effect happening. This is where you can start to make those tweaks. Like I was saying, we are using black text in this example. I'll probably switch this back to white, and just to kind of preview what that looks like, can change all the component settings. And to me, this looks good. Obviously, you'd want to check for enough, contrast with some sort of accessibility tool. But this is where, for example, if we didn't have enough frost and I felt like when you're moving over certain layers, it's just too tough to see. So you might want to like increase that a little bit to like 25, and maybe your fill goes a little higher. It's also where you could change the fill color. So if the white is too strong, maybe you switch to the darker overlay or find somewhere in between. You get the idea. Let's change this logo to something more fun, like this light blue looks good. Now let's create the frame for our avatar. So if you hit F and then hold Shift and drag, that'll create a perfect square. I'm gonna do 32 pixels and we'll add a fill to that. And then if you load your avatars plugin, this will actually give you a couple free options. You can just click add and it'll change that fill for you. And I want this to be a circle, so we'll change the radius to maximum 999. So we've got our avatar, we can throw that in at the bottom. We're gonna add a username as well. And if you wanna add subtext, something like admin. This text I'm probably gonna keep a little smaller. Even the role will probably be like 12 pixels, and then maybe we'll do like a 72% white, just so it's not quite as vibrant. We can just group this together. So the name and the role, I'm gonna put an auto layout, just a couple pixels of spacing, and then we'll connect the avatar and the name, and we'll change that direction so it's in line. If you wanted to add something like a light mode, dark mode toggle, or settings, you can also just paste that icon in here. I'm actually gonna be using dark mode as like a switch within this setting, and then we're gonna add the sidebar collapse icon at the top right. So if you'd rather have the sidebar in this section, you could play around with whatever positioning and styling you want. Just know that you're gonna need at least some trigger to be able to obviously change from a default to a collapsed state. So we'll paste that in there and make sure that your alignment for this whole bottom kind of footer section is vertically aligned to the middle, and then just set that to fill. You might need to make sure that the text layers are also set to fill, just so it's changing that width. We really want this to be reactive to the width of the widest sidebar or the longest label. Typically when you're designing something like this from a component point of view, you'd want to establish like a max width. So for some of our sidebar items, maybe we say the max width is 100 pixels. So whatever that works out to be in characters, 20 characters, 30 characters, and then if it goes beyond that, it's just going to truncate or jump to a new line. That way that what that maximum width of the sidebar is, you're not going to end up with something way out here. For the sake of this, we're just going to change the sidebar items layout to just set to hug. And then we can just set the whole sidebar to hug as well. So basically the width is going to be determined by this component. And like I said, if you go way too wide, it's just going to keep expanding, but you can set those maximum widths and heights as you need. So this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to tweak the spacing a little bit, maybe add 20 pixels between. And typically, a sidebar is going to be full width or full height rather of the page. So you may want to drag this all the way to the bottom and just say it's always 760 pixels, for example. In this case, we would always want this little footer to be at the bottom. So what we would want to do is select our sidebar items, and I'm just going to rename this to sidebar items, and change the height to fill. So that just means that the logo is always going to be on the top, the user's avatar and the settings are always on the bottom, and then the majority of the space is just filled with that auto layout. So in this case, the logo is actually wider than the item name, so we could probably scale this down, maybe something like 25 pixels tall, and just make sure that's center aligned. Let's add some real labels just for the sake of sanity and realism. Dashboard, reports, transfers. And then let's change this to be the reports page. Let's say will be the active state, and we can get a sense of what that looks like. So you may notice as soon as I changed that, the label got overwritten. The reason for this is probably because we are not storing that property. So because I was showing you how to change that in the default state, and I linked only the default state, we had that overwritten. So just know if you have a property you're applying for something like a text label, you need to apply it across all the variants. You cannot just have it on one. So to fix that, we just select the others and make sure it's linked to that label. And you can see that immediately fixed the issue in our component. Or if you just want to be able to override it and not care about it being at the component level, you just don't need to create a property. Next, we'll create our logo component. So I'm going to just drag this out and we're going to turn this into a component. We're going to add another variant and we can just duplicate that like that. And I'm going to be a little lazy and just really remove all the other letters and just have it be this L. And then we can just flatten that. I forgot the dot. Let's just jump back to the prototype really quick and show you when you collapse that sidebar. Obviously, we're having a lot less space and real estate for our icons to fit. So one of the hacks I've seen, I actually stole this from the ChatGPT interface sidebar, is once you go to the collapsed view, you can hover over the logo and it'll change to your expanded icon. So if we jump back to the logo component, let's add one more variant. And then we're going to replace this with a sidebar icon. So we can delete that and just paste our logo in there. It's important to keep the square version of the logo actually square. So I actually have this at 16, so we'll just change this to 24 by 24 and just make sure it's centered. And we'll just match that with the sidebar icon as well. Last thing to do here is if you jump into prototype mode, click the variant 2, we'll just drag this to the sidebar icon and change that to while hovering. And if you want to give these labels, we can call this, default, we'll call this collapsed, and then just call it logo hover. Now all we have to do is just build out our collapse state. So let's go ahead and drag what we were building in our demo. We can turn that into a component and just name it sidebar. And then we're going to add a new variant. Now, because we're already using auto layout on this component, it's going to go ahead and add it on top of the component as well. So that just means that if we add a variant here, it's going to be pushing it to the bottom. And you could also just put it side by changing the layout. But then, as you can see, the width of these is going to change. So make sure on the first one, we still set that width to hug. And you can just drag out your component width there. And then for the second collapse state, usually this is something you can just define as like, we're going to have 100 pixel wide. We'll tweak this and dial it in a little bit, but in case that happens and you're using auto layout, that's why your components are jumping all over the place. For the sake of sanity, I'm going to add a fill behind this component just so we can see what we're doing. Now here is where we can just switch over all of the components to those collapse states. So for the logo, we actually need to replace this. So this is still that kind of vector layer. Just copy the logo, that default state, click into the logo here, hit Command-Shift-R. That's going to paste to replace, and then same here on the collapsed variant. And then on that second collapsed variant, we can just change this to the collapsed state for that logo. And then same thing for all the sidebar items. In this case, we'll say show label, we'll turn that off. Now you could also have created a component from this whole footer. In this case, I really only care about the avatar, so I'm just gonna pretty much hide the dark mode toggle and then the frame for the labels as well. And then you might just need to center that out for the avatar. Now we could have also kept it to hug as well for our collapse state. It's gonna look fine. You just might also need to adjust the padding if you do so. I'm going for more of a pretty slim, compact look like this, where pretty much the icons are the widest piece. But if you wanna just maintain everything, you could leave that width of the collapse state to hug, and then you'll just might need to adjust the padding is something to note. So the last bit here is just to add that collapse trigger, and then we can hook this up in prototype mode and we're good to go. So I'm gonna add this same icon we used for the logo. We'll move that over here and paste it next to our logo. Now you could just use absolute positioning if that's the style you want. So if we did that, we'd select the icon, absolute, and just pin it kind of toward the top, something like that. And that looks fine. I actually want mine to be in line with the logo. So I'm gonna go back here and just connect these in a group and center that. Let's change the icon to be white. And then we can hit the icon, make sure that's selected, jump into prototype mode, and then just drag an arrow to the collapse state. And this, all you have to do is leave it to on click. You can adjust the animation. You do want to make sure it's set to smart animate, but you can adjust the style if you want it to be, super snappy or kind of have a bounce effect. You could play around with those. I'm using this quick at 600 milliseconds. And then inside of the collapse state, just select your logo, still in prototype mode, and then just click and drag back. Now, even though we're looking at the square logo and not the collapse sidebar icon, it'll automatically memorize that prototype interaction. So when it hovers over, it'll store that click so that when you hover over the logo and you click, it'll expand the sidebar. You'll see what I mean in a second, but final thing to do here would be just to make sure the icon is also set to white so it's consistent, and then let's drag an instance of our sidebar in. We jump into prototype mode, should be able to click that icon. We can hover over the logo just like this, and it'll expand back out. So that's a pretty in-depth look at building out your liquid glass sidebar in Figma. You could probably start to see here that the legibility isn't perfect. I wasn't really paying attention to colors, and again, you could start to tweak the glass effect. One of the best pieces of advice I could give is probably to add a dimmer fill. That's going to make the biggest difference. So even just dragging this down a little bit from 100% white to 30% gray, something like that, automatically makes it a lot easier to read. It's just going to be so dependent on how you're layering this, what visuals are behind, how much text you have. All those type of things are important to consider. But hopefully you feel like you have all the different tools and know-how on how to mix and match to get what you want. That's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it or it was helpful, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.